I remember the first time I stepped into Greenwood Hospital's abandoned maternity wing, the stale odor of antiseptic mingling with a damp, musty smell that wafted through the dimly lit corridors, and how the echoes of my own footsteps seemed to mock my courage as I clutched the old ring of keys assigned to me, determined to fulfill the caretaker role I had rashly accepted for the night shift. Despite the countless rumors of eerie sightings and hushed whispers among the hospital's staff, little did I know that those silent hallways, lined with peeling wallpaper and haunted by the ghosts of long-forgotten lullabies, would soon become the stage for events so unnerving that I would question every belief I held about the natural order of things, as though the very walls were steeped in memories too painful to fade, clinging to shadows that slid across the floor like living, watchful beings. At the time, I was a fresh graduate in need of a steady paycheck, and when my supervisor offhandedly mentioned the vacant position for an overnight caretaker in this decommissioned section of the hospital, I felt an inexplicable surge of bravado, brushing off tales of phantom nurses roaming the corridors as superstitions that only the gullible would heed, convinced that my rational mind could withstand any fleeting spook. However, from the moment I stepped into that locked ward, with doors that groaned in protest and a hush so absolute it felt like a collective breath had been held for decades, I sensed a suffocating heaviness pressing on my shoulders, as if the building itself were alive and profoundly aware of my intrusion into its somber recesses. Even the creaky elevator at the far end of the corridor seemed to rattle more ominously than any other I had ridden, its interior reeking of stale air and old metal, and every time I pressed the button to descend or ascend, a cold draft brushed against my neck, giving me the uneasy impression that I was never quite alone in that cramped box. In the first few hours of my shift, I tried to stay busy by organizing scattered files, dusting off countertops coated in a thin layer of gray residue, and checking that the overhead lights were functioning, but my every motion felt scrutinized by intangible eyes, the slight rustle of my uniform sounding unnaturally loud in the hush, and the fleeting shapes I thought I saw at the edge of my vision made my heart pound in trepidation. Near the waiting area, I noticed an old vinyl chair positioned under a singular flickering light, and though I told myself it was just an inanimate piece of furniture, there were moments when the cushion seemed to indent on its own, as if someone had quietly taken a seat to observe me, only for it to spring back into shape a second later, leaving me with an inexplicable sense of unease. I tried to shrug off these sensations, reminding myself that Greenwood Hospital was well over a century old, riddled with faulty wiring and drafty corridors that could simulate all manner of unsettling phenomena. Yet as the clock neared midnight, a profound stillness settled over the corridors, transforming even the slightest faucet drip or fluorescent buzz into a portent of something indescribably sinister lurking just out of sight. Refusing to let my imagination get the better of me, I methodically worked through the caretaker's checklist with shaky determination, stepping into each patient room to verify that the windows were secure, only to be greeted by inexplicable cold spots and a faint chemical odor reminiscent of bandages steeped in antiseptic, stirring my stomach with uneasy familiarity. I will never forget when I entered what had once been the pediatric ward, my flashlight beam slicing through the inky dark to reveal row after row of miniature cribs, each casting warped shadows on the tiled floor, and that was when I first heard the soft, haunting tune of a lullaby, drifting through the stale air as if carried by a gentle breeze that had no logical source. Desperate to prove my rationality, I convinced myself the sound was merely the building's archaic plumbing or a draft whistling through hidden vents. Yet the more I advanced down the corridor, following that ethereal melody, the harder my heart hammered against my ribs, until I found myself pausing at a half-open door, bracing for the unimaginable to step forth. Eventually, I discovered a locked door labeled Nurses' Lounge, an area that my map indicated was off-limits to all current personnel, but unable to quell my growing anxiety. I began testing each of the old keys on my heavy ring, telling myself that confirming the lounge was merely an empty, defunct space would help me maintain my composure. When the correct key finally turned in the corroded lock, the decisive click echoed alarmingly in the dark hallway, almost as if it signaled the start of some grim performance, and for several moments, I hesitated with my hand on the doorknob, lungs tight with apprehension, half expecting to find a swarm of apparitions waiting on the other side. To my astonishment, the lounge looked eerily well-preserved, as though the nurses who once bustled about here had merely stepped out for their rounds, leaving behind neat piles of paperwork on the battered wooden coffee table, a warm-looking blanket tossed over one arm of the couch, and a rocking chair that moved ever so slightly, its legs scraping the floor in a rhythmic, nerve-prickling pattern that seemed to defy the absence of any breeze. I stood transfixed by the rocking chair, wanting to attribute its swaying motion to my overactive imagination, but when it abruptly knocked into the wall with a hollow thud, I felt ice race up my spine, forcing me to confront the possibility that something beyond my understanding was stirring in this place, reminding me with each creak that I was trespassing. Yearning for any sort of logical explanation, I rifled through old binders stacked on the lounge's main desk, flipping through page after page of meticulous notes cataloging patient routines, night shift protocols, and emergent checklists. And there in almost every file, I caught sight of the name Nurse Connolly, always signed in neat, flowing script, often accompanied by cryptic mentions that she was on duty when the lights go out. With growing dread, I pored over these yellowing pages, my flashlight revealing descriptions of unexplained footsteps during the graveyard shift, peculiar temperature drops in specific rooms, and children's laughter echoing at odd hours, all documented in such calm, clinical language that the authors seemed to be trying to maintain some semblance of professional order in the face of inexplicable happenings. Among the most unsettling entries was an account of how Nurse Connolly allegedly materialized in the pediatric ward at unpredictable moments, gently humming lullabies to restless patients and ushering them back to their beds, even though other nurses swore they had just seen her at the front desk or conversing with a doctor in a different wing entirely. As I read these entries, a knot of sympathy and fear twisted inside me, for it appeared the staff of decades past had been trapped between tending to their patients and coping with the pervasive sense that something otherworldly hovered among them, embodied in a phantom nurse who seemed to appear at will and vanish just as swiftly. Driven by a mix of morbid curiosity and a weird sense of responsibility, I pressed on into the lounge, letting the beam of my flashlight dance across battered cabinets and an archaic refrigerator, bracing myself for the sudden reflection of a spectral figure behind me. Yet all I caught was my own pale face, tense with apprehension, staring back from the refrigerator's metallic surface. In a corner near the window, I noticed a partially open locker, inside of which lay a sepia-toned photograph of a woman in a crisp uniform, her eyes kind but sad, the corners of her lips curved into what could have been a comforting smile or a resigned expression, and though time had faded some letters from its handwritten label, I could just decipher the word Connolly. Her gentle demeanor in that photograph tugged at my heart, and for a fleeting moment, I found myself wondering if the tales surrounding this so-called night nurse had been twisted by fear and rumor, perhaps obscuring a compassionate caretaker's lingering spirit that simply could not let go of her duty, trapped within these walls long after her mortal life had ended. Yet, as if to challenge my flicker of empathy, the overhead lights in the lounge began to flicker violently, plunging the room into a stuttering dance of brightness and darkness, and in those chaotic flashes, I could have sworn I saw a figure by the couch, dressed in a stark white uniform, head tilted in an uncanny angle, silently observing me. My blood roared in my ears, and my first instinct was to flee, yet something compelled me to stay rooted in place, caught between flight and the unshakable curiosity that perhaps she was trying to communicate, and in that tense pocket of time, I heard the faintest whisper, as though someone murmured my name in the gentlest of tones, echoing from the very spot where I'd seen her silhouette. Heart hammering, I snapped my flashlight toward the couch, finding no one there, just a slightly ruffled blanket and cushions that bore the slightest impression, as though someone had been seated only seconds ago, disappearing the instant I dared to confront the reality of her presence. Logic warred with my senses, and I knew that sharing such a story with my supervisor or colleagues would earn me nothing but skeptical smiles and sympathetic nods. So I did the only thing I could think of at the time. I retrieved my caretaker's log, detailing the flickering lights and sudden chills, omitting the more supernatural elements lest I sound deranged, my pen trembling with each word. After locking the lounge behind me, my hands clammy with sweat, I wandered back into the corridor, only to feel that the silence had grown denser, as though everything beyond my flashlight's glow was suspended in a predatory stillness, waiting for me to make a wrong move or step further into the hospital's secret-filled belly. With each step, I became increasingly convinced that I was being followed, for faint footsteps seemed to echo behind me, never closing in, yet never allowing me to forget that I was not alone, and each time I dared to glance over my shoulder, there was only emptiness, cold, watchful emptiness. Rounding each corner became a psychological test, for I braced myself to confront a spectral figure in every hallway, picturing her pale face suddenly illuminated by my flashlight, or hearing the distant hum of that soft lullaby, the notes unraveling something deep inside me that oscillated between intrigue and horror. Yet amid the terror, a reluctant compassion flickered in my thoughts, for the logbooks had not once described Nurse Connolly harming a patient or causing overt harm to her colleagues. Instead, she always appeared to be guiding lost souls, her voice a calm presence in the old wards, almost as if she refused to abandon her vocation even in death. This unsettling paradox sank into my consciousness, the realization that something so frightening and unnatural could also bear traces of empathy, as though the spirit of a caregiver lingered here, bound to the hospital by devotion and sorrow, turning corridors into her perpetual vigil. As the night dragged on, I found my nerves wearing thin, yet a strange part of me yearned for another sighting, if only to prove that I was not succumbing to hallucinations born of stress and isolation, that there was indeed a soul caught between realms, restless yet oddly protective. Not long after, the hospital's antiquated intercom system crackled to life, spewing out static that reverberated through the hallway, forcing a startled yelp from my throat as I fumbled with the flashlight. And within that jumble of static, I discerned the faint echo of that same lullaby, each note drifting like a plea from a bygone era. Blood pounding in my veins, I rushed toward the nearest intercom panel, half expecting to find someone playing a cruel prank, but as soon as my fingertips touched the microphone button, the lullaby faded, replaced by a low electrical hum that sounded almost disappointed, as though the presence had receded back into the gloom upon sensing my skepticism. With adrenaline coursing through me, I pressed my forehead against the wall, the cool tiles offering a momentary refuge from the heat of my own fear, and in a trembling whisper, I apologized to the silence, uncertain if I was speaking to the flickering shadows, to Nurse Connolly, or to the battered part of my own psyche that clung to denial. An old superstition from my childhood surfaced in my mind, stories of offering tokens to appease kindly spirits, and though it felt absurd, I placed a small wrapped chocolate bar from my pocket onto the receptionist's desk, quietly voicing my intention for peace, and in that moment, I almost hoped I would see it vanish, if only to confirm the unseen caretaker's gratitude or acknowledgement. Continuing my rounds, I made sure to stay within the corridors that still had functioning emergency lights, yet every so often I would sense movement in the peripheral darkness, a faint flicker of white cloth passing by doorways or retreating around corners, fueling my growing conviction that Nurse Connolly was watching, evaluating my motives. Time lost its usual rhythm in the gloom, and when I glanced at my watch again, only an hour had passed since midnight, an agonizing realization that I still had the bulk of the night shift to endure, and the atmosphere felt charged with tension, as if the hospital's unseen inhabitants hovered just beyond my line of sight, waiting for a decisive moment to reveal themselves more fully. Despite the tremors of fear coursing through me, an odd sense of empathy began to seep in whenever I remembered the nurse's photograph, the soft compassion in her eyes suggesting that in life she had likely cared for the vulnerable with unwavering dedication, which made the notion of her roaming these halls in death both tragic and oddly comforting. With these conflicted emotions swirling inside me like a storm, I resolved to press forward, gripping my flashlight with white-knuckled determination, resolved to learn more about this elusive night nurse who lingered in Greenwood Hospital's corridors, unsure if I was driven by fear, curiosity, or a yearning to offer the kind of solace she might have once given her patients, all the while unaware that the hours ahead would confront me with revelations far darker and far more heartbreakingly human than I could ever have conceived. After I finished my rounds in the abandoned maternity wing and documented every flickering light and spectral whisper in my caretaker's log, I couldn't shake the feeling that Nurse Connolly was actively guiding my every step, as though her gentle yet unyielding presence wished to lead me toward long-buried secrets hidden in the hospital's architecture. And despite the fear that had my heart rattling in my ribcage, I found a strange sort of quiet resolve swelling in my chest, spurring me onward. Through corridors that stretched like solemn tunnels into the unknown, my shift felt interminable, and though the hospital's official guidelines demanded I rotate through the entire building, checking the stability of floors and ensuring no unauthorized visitors prowl the darkness, my intuition insisted that I return to the pediatric ward where I had first heard her lullaby, an ethereal melody that clung to the back of my mind like the echo of a half-remembered dream, each note tinged with both sorrow and a gentle longing for closure. The overhead lights along the main hallway glowed erratically, sputtering in fits and starts, painting the chipped plaster walls with a dance of shadows that took on sinister shapes. But I kept my flashlight close, knuckles white around the handle, and stepped softly as if I were intruding upon some silent vigil, hoping to maintain whatever delicate truce existed between me and the restless spirit whose domain I dared to traverse. I approached the set of swinging doors that separated the pediatric section from the rest of the hospital, and with each step, the emptiness behind me felt charged with tension, as if countless unseen eyes observed my every move. But the memory of the nurse's photograph, the sadness in her eyes contrasting with her determined stance, compelled me to continue, breathing shallowly as I pushed open those doors to confront whatever might lurk within. Beyond the threshold, the corridor widened into a broad passage flanked by old, pastel murals depicting cartoonish animals and bright balloons, a futile attempt to make a medical setting feel welcoming to children. Yet now those once cheerful illustrations felt off-kilter, their colors dulled by layers of dust and time, the brushstrokes distorted by peeling paint that lent a grotesque quality to smiling faces that had once exuded joy. A scattering of tiny footprints still stained the scuffed linoleum floor, forever etched from some long-ago day, and as my steps echoed into the hush, I imagined that I could hear small voices giggling in the distance, an eerie phenomenon that blended innocence and tragedy, reminding me of the lost lives that had once occupied these cots and rooms, forever overshadowed by the hospital's closure and rumored curse. Treading carefully, I came upon a line of tiny metal-framed beds, each with railings meant to keep restless children from falling out, and in my flashlight's beam, I noticed that a few of the blankets, thin and threadbare, were folded down in the corners, as though some conscientious nurse had prepared them for the little patient she believed would soon return, an unsettling sight that sank like a stone in my stomach, reinforcing the idea that Nurse Connolly's dedication persisted even beyond the veil of death. As I drew closer to the farthest crib, I heard it, a soft humming that reminded me of my grandmother's lullabies. Yet this time, the melody carried a rasping undercurrent that seemed to reverberate against my bones, and I felt an immediate chill racing through my body, goosebumps erupting on my arms as I strained to listen for any indication of where the voice might be coming from, my breath catching in my throat. Summoning every ounce of courage I possessed, I followed that lullaby until I stood before a narrow door labeled pediatric storage, and though it was sealed with a rusted lock, the faint sound of humming slipped through the gap beneath it, beckoning me like a siren's call, stirring an irrational desire to discover the truth, even if it meant confronting the stuff of nightmares hidden behind that barrier. I fumbled with the ring of keys, hands trembling as I tried each one, and with every wrong fit, the humming seemed to swell in volume, as though urging me to hurry or perhaps warning me of what lay ahead, until finally the lock gave way with a sharp click that echoed loudly in the oppressive darkness, and for a moment I hesitated, pressing my forehead to the door's chilly surface, wondering if I was about to cross a threshold of no return. Steeling myself, I swung the door open, revealing a cramped room stacked with medical supplies left to decay. Boxes of bandages crumbled with age, cracked plastic containers leaking half-solidified antiseptics, and shelves lined with dusty jars of baby formula decades past its expiration date. Yet overshadowing this disarray was the undeniable presence of something intangible and pulsing, like a memory that refused to die, swirling in the stagnant air. Toward the back of this cramped space, a narrow window allowed a faint shaft of moonlight to spill onto a desk piled with old charts and a tattered diary, its spine cracked and pages curled as though it had been repeatedly opened and closed in haste. And as I inched closer, the lullaby began to subside, replaced by a breathy silence that felt like a held confession waiting to be read. My flashlight illuminated the diary's cover, revealing a handwritten inscription in ornate script, property of M. Connolly Erin, and my heart clenched at the realization that this could be the key to understanding the mysterious nurse whose restless spirit had seemingly taken to roaming these halls, compelled by a duty that outlived her mortal lifespan. Carefully, I lifted the diary from the dusty desk, brushing away cobwebs clinging to its yellowed surface, and with trembling fingers I opened it, discovering page after page of neat, meticulous notes detailing daily routines in the pediatric ward, dosages for sickly infants, small anecdotal stories of children who overcame their ailments, and heartbreakingly detailed accounts of those who did not survive, their names underlined with shaky penmanship and accompanied by quiet lamentations for lives cut short. Each entry revealed a side of Nurse Connolly that the rumors and legends never captured, a compassionate soul who took it upon herself to hold the hands of frightened children in the dead of night, to softly sing them lullabies when their fevers raged, and to ensure they felt warmth and love even when their families could not remain at their bedsides, a testament to her unwavering commitment that gleamed like a fragile beacon amid the darkness. Yet as I turned the pages, I noticed a gradual shift in tone. The once cheerful stories of children recovering from ailments gave way to confusion and fear, references to a creeping malevolence that she sensed lurking in the corridors after dusk, a shadowy figure that appeared at the end of the hall, accompanied by the distinct odor of rot and a suffocating pressure that made the lights flicker whenever it drew near. Her handwriting, once graceful, began to falter, the lines slanting as she recounted nights when she felt paralyzed by dread, watching a black mass drift from room to room, leaving behind a sense of profound anguish. And though the diary never named this presence directly, her words hinted that something ancient and malignant had latched itself onto the hospital, feeding on the despair of the sick and the dying. I felt my stomach twist as I read her desperate pleas to the administration to relocate the children, her repeated attempts to alert doctors that an unexplainable darkness seemed to be affecting the patient's emotional well-being, only to be brushed aside with reassurances that she was overworked, overly imaginative, or outright delusional, until her warnings were effectively ignored. One particular entry, dated just weeks before the wing's closure, chilled me to the core. In a trembling script, Nurse Connolly described how she stayed up all night to protect her patients from the looming darkness, chanting quiet prayers while rocking babies in her arms, even as the lights flickered ominously, and how she believed she could hear the entity rasping her name in the hushed intervals between infant cries. A horrifying intimacy that suggested it had singled her out as a threat. By the time I reached the final pages, I could barely control my shaking hands, for the entries became fragmentary, scattered thoughts of an exhausted nurse battling forces far beyond her understanding. And when the last paragraphs contained a haunting line that read, "I cannot abandon them, even if it takes my last breath, for a nurse's duty does not end when the shift is over, especially not when their guardian is needed most in the darkness." I closed the diary, my mind buzzing with the chilling realization that Nurse Connolly, through her selfless devotion, had in some way bound herself to this place, her spirit remaining tethered by her protective instinct and perhaps also by the fear of the malevolent presence she described, which might still linger in the hospital's labyrinthine corridors, feeding on the uneasy hush of abandoned rooms. Suddenly, an icy draft swept through the cramped storage area, extinguishing what little warmth remained, and my flashlight sputtered, casting erratic beams across the walls, revealing fleeting silhouettes that vanished as soon as my eyes tried to settle upon them. An unmistakable sensation that something else had joined me in that cramped space, absorbing the energy from the air itself. A slow, methodical scrape against the floor behind me jolted my senses, and I whirled around to see a tall medical cabinet shifting ever so slightly, its metal legs dragging against the tiles, as though pushed by an unseen force, and in that moment, the lullaby returned in broken fragments, a halting melody of heartbreak that vibrated through the metal shelves, urging me simultaneously to flee and to remain, torn between self-preservation and the call to discover the truth. With my pulse thundering in my ears, I forced myself to approach the cabinet, shining my flickering flashlight on the sterile surface, half expecting a horrifying face to emerge from the dark gap beneath. But all I found was an unsettling emptiness, a place where shadows writhed without a discernible source, until the scraping noise abruptly ceased, and the hush that followed felt more menacing than any growl or scream could have been. In that pregnant silence, I heard a soft intake of breath, a sound that should not have existed in that deserted room, and a voice, a woman's voice, spoke barely above a whisper, as though addressing me from inches away, saying, "They needed me," which sent a jolt of electricity through my spine and made every hair on my arms stand on end, for I knew instantly that Nurse Connolly was trying to communicate, bridging the gap between her world and mine. My legs threatened to give out, but I found enough courage to ask, in a shaky tone that betrayed my fear, "What do you want me to do?" hoping that I could offer her some measure of peace, or at the very least, understand how to free her from the unseen chains that bound her spirit to this building. And in that moment, the air seemed to throb with tension, as though the hospital itself were listening to our exchange. No immediate answer came, yet an intangible compulsion urged me back into the hallway, leading me to retrace my steps to the nurse's lounge where I had first encountered the rocking chair, determined that if I could somehow piece together the fragments of her story, I might uncover the next step, for the notion that she and I were engaged in some kind of silent collaboration was too strong to ignore. Walking through the pediatric ward again, I felt a profound sadness wash over me, imagining the nights she must have spent comforting children in their final moments, clinging to her sense of duty in a place marred by shadows. And I wondered if the rumored black entity thrived on the sorrow that pervaded these rooms, perhaps growing stronger with every tear shed, every life lost under its looming presence. As I passed those tiny beds once more, a movement at the edge of my vision made my heart skip, and I turned just in time to glimpse a fleeting figure in a stark white uniform, her posture tense as she paced between the rows of cribs, head bowed in what appeared to be profound remorse or exhaustion, before she vanished like mist dissolving under a harsh light, leaving me with only the echo of her footsteps reverberating in my memory. I reached the lounge, each door groaning in protest at my approach, and found the rocking chair still swaying gently, its motion far too steady to be blamed on drafts alone, and the overhead light flickered, revealing fleeting images of a nurse's silhouette behind the chair, my eyes trying to focus, only to lose the figure in the throbbing darkness as soon as the next flicker disrupted my vision. Rallying my courage, I placed Nurse Connolly's diary on the lounge's central table, opening it to the final entry and reading it aloud in a trembling voice, as though by speaking her words, I could somehow help her spirit find resolution. The stale air seemed to pulse in response, and I nearly cried out when the rocking chair intensified its rhythm, each creak a plaintive groan that spoke of centuries of sorrow compressed into a single heartbeat. A swirl of wind battered the lounge's interior, sending loose papers airborne and rattling the blinds against the window, as though the hospital itself was reacting to the power of her words. And in that whirlwind of swirling documents, I thought I saw faint glimpses of children's faces etched onto the pages, their gazes forlorn yet hopeful, an impression that lasted only the fraction of a second before reality snapped back into the dimly lit quiet. Desperate for clarity, I leafed through the remaining official hospital files on the coffee table, discovering correspondences from administrators who dismissed Nurse Connolly's urgent pleas to shut down the pediatric wing early, labeling her concerns as emotional distress unsubstantiated by medical proof, revealing a systemic negligence that might have led to more child fatalities than anyone dared to publicly acknowledge, a fact that weighed heavily on my conscience. Yet buried among those cold, bureaucratic memos was a faded notice from a local funeral home, confirming arrangements for the bodies of multiple children who had died within days of each other, and scribbled along the margin in shaky handwriting were the words, "Their eyes still open. They deserve peace," I tried, a testament to the nurse's anguish and the guilt that might have compelled her spirit to remain, desperately seeking to rectify what she perceived as her own failure. I whispered to the air, feeling foolish yet strangely sincere, "I'm sorry for what happened. I know you did your best." And for a heartbeat, everything in the lounge fell silent. No creaking, no flickering, only the faint hum of electricity in the walls, until a faint, ghostly presence pressed against my shoulder, not menacing, but almost comforting, and I closed my eyes, fighting the urge to panic at the contact of a hand that didn't belong to the living. When I opened my eyes, the rocking chair had stopped abruptly, halted mid-sway as though someone had risen from it in a hurry, and the hall outside reverberated with a distant crash, prompting me to rush out of the lounge in time to see a single door at the far end of the corridor slam shut, the sign on it reading "Basement Access, Authorized Personnel Only," fueling my intuition that this was where I needed to go next. Even though my heart hammered with dread at the thought of venturing into the basement, where the hospital's abandoned archives and outdated machinery likely rusted in the darkness, the memory of Nurse Connolly's diary entries propelled me forward, reminding me that the malevolent force she encountered might still fester there, and that if I had any hope of releasing her spirit and restoring peace to the hospital, I needed to confront whatever entity lay hidden beneath the floors. Navigating the winding stairwell down to the basement felt like a plunge into a subterranean realm, the only light my shaky flashlight beam illuminating concrete walls streaked with mold, and each footstep rang hollow, echoing as though the corridors themselves stretched into impossible depths, the stagnant air thick with the stench of neglect and something vaguely metallic, pricking my nostrils in a way that made my stomach churn. At the foot of the stairs, the corridor branched off into multiple halls lined with locked rooms, some marked records, some marked maintenance, all silent as tombs, and although the hush was claustrophobic, I sensed an undercurrent of dark energy thrumming through these walls, as though the malicious presence that Nurse Connolly wrote about had pooled here, intensifying over the years, waiting for the unwary to stumble into its grasp. With trembling resolve, I clutched the diary to my chest as I advanced through the murk, aware that I was treading on haunted ground where unspoken horrors lingered, but bolstered by the faint hope that the compassion binding me to Nurse Connolly's story might be enough to bring her, and possibly the lost souls she guarded, some measure of release, and into the suffocating gloom that devoured these corridors, unaware that my final confrontation with the darkness would test the limits of my courage, my sanity, and my own mortality in ways I could scarcely imagine.